Hello. Today we're peeling back the curtain on a case that shocked small-town America in the 1990s. A ghost-like killer who left taunting notes in a strange, smiling drawing at every turn. The media called him the Smiling Killer. Who was he? Could the police uncover the truth, or would the darkness keep swallowing answers? Settle in, because this is a story about vanished women, false confessions, a deadly obsession with attention, and a killer who couldn't resist signing his work. On May 21, 1990, a gray, drizzle-soaked Sunday in Portland, Oregon, 23-year-old Tan Gia put on a raincoat, slung a bag over her shoulder, and stepped out the door. She was a bright, outgoing young woman who lived with her mother and liked to spend weekends unwinding with friends at a local bar. Portland, a place known for its wet winters and dry summers, also had a reputation for being relatively safe. A city where people still left doors unlocked, and where a night out rarely ended in real danger. That complacency would soon be shattered. That evening, Tun met a friend at the bar. The friend left early, bored, but Tun stayed behind and drank with a group, including several men her friend didn't know. Later, Tun didn't return home. At first, her mother didn't panic. This sort of thing had happened before. Maybe Tun had crashed at a friend's, but by the next day there was no sign of her. A cold dread crept into her mother's chest. She called Tan's friend, who admitted Tan had stayed with some men she didn't recognize. The friend left early. Tun had stayed. 2 days after Tun disappeared, on May 23rd, a motorist driving along a lonely stretch of the Columbia Gorge pulled over to relieve himself. When he stepped out of his car, he spotted a young woman lying motionless in the underbrush. Her eyes were wide, her skin pale. She was dead. The man's call to the authorities set a frantic chain in motion. Officers sealed the scene. The victim, a young woman in a long-sleeved red top, jeans and sneakers, bore clear signs of violence. Her right hand was clutching at her neck, where a deep ligature mark suggested strangulation. The autopsy revealed multiple injuries and evidence of assault prior to death. Time of death, roughly 2 days earlier. No ID, no wallet, no bag, nothing to point to who she was, except for a ripped piece of fabric torn from her jeans. Detectives believed they were not looking at the place where the murder happened, but at a dump site, a remote spot chosen to hide a body. The area had no cameras and no witnesses, and the investigation stalled. When the story hit the local news, Tan's mother watched and froze. The clothing matched what her daughter had been wearing that night. She called the police. The corpse was confirmed, Tan Gia, 23. What followed was a frantic, methodical attempt to reconstruct the last hours of Tan's life. She had been drinking at a bar near Interstate 5. Her friend had left early. Tun had stayed with some men. Witnesses at the bar later said they had seen her leave with a very tall man, roughly 2 meters tall. But because the bar had no surveillance and the witness descriptions were fuzzy, the lead went cold. Days bled into a week with nothing useful arriving at the station. Then, 13 days after Tan's body was found, the case suddenly took a wild turn. Police received an anonymous phone call from a woman claiming she knew the killer's identity, a man named Yo Solovsky. Detectives were initially skeptical. Yo, they learned, was a 39-year-old drifter with previous arrests for drunk driving and a reputation as a troublemaker. The caller continued to press. 2 more calls, then a face-to-face identification. And under interrogation, the woman finally revealed her name, Levetner. Levetner said the man she'd accused, Joe, was the live-in boyfriend she'd been deeply entangled with. She painted a grim picture. Joe, she claimed, was cruel and violent. He had bragged about picking up women at rest stops off Interstate 5, then taking them away. She said he had admitted to abducting a girl at a rest stop and that, on the night Tan vanished, Joe had taken Tan to a cheap transient room at a place called Vitha House. According to Levetner, Joe had forced Tan into the room, assaulted her, and strangled her when she threatened to go to the police. Levetner claimed she had helped. Unwillingly, she said. And then the two disposed of the body in the Columbia Gorge. She produced a scrap of torn denim she claimed Joe had ripped from Tan's jeans, and she gave a piece of paper with scribbled words and a name that she said matched Joe's handwriting. The police pounced. Joe denied everything. He consented to a polygraph at the detective's insistence. Under questioning, his heart rate and breathing spiked when asked about tone. And while the polygraph suggested deception, the law treated those results only as guidance, not proof. With no other hard evidence, Joe was released. Then Levetner delivered more. She gave police a ragged piece of denim she insisted matched the ripped fabric from Ton's jeans. That scrap went to the lab for comparison. Meanwhile, the police secretly wired Levetner, hoping she'd say something incriminating on recorded conversations. The taped interrogations produced nothing decisive. Joe was careful and circumspect. When the lab results finally returned, they were devastating. The denim Levetner had provided did not match the fragment taken from Ton's jeans. The lab results suggested the torn fabric had been fabricated. There was something else. Investigators uncovered motive. Levetner and Yo's relationship was violent and volatile. Levetner had reason to resent Yo, and in the weeks after the murder, she'd called the police multiple times, her statements inconsistent. It appeared Levetner might have constructed a narrative to pin the crime on the man who had abused her. But then an astonishing twist changed everything. Under pressure, Levetner altered her story again. She suddenly confessed to participating in the murder herself, claiming that on the night in question, she and Yo had halted at a rest stop on Interstate 5, met Ton, and offered her a ride. She said Joe had offered to drop Ton home, but instead drove to Vytha House. There, Levetner would say, Joe assaulted Ton. Levetner stood by and watched in fear. When Ton threatened to call the police, Yo snapped and strangled her. Levetner claimed she tried to help, but ultimately assisted in loading the body into the car. Together, they dumped it in the Columbia Gorge. Police took Levetner to the discovery site and asked her to point out the exact place. She did, with unnerving precision. That confirmation, combined with her heated, repeated phone calls to police and the denim scrap, even if later discredited, led to the arrest of both Levetner and Yo on murder charges. Their detention ignited a media firestorm. A middle-aged woman who had once seemed meek, Levetner, was now at the heart of a brutal, senseless case. A year passed. In the lead-up to the trial, Levetner retracted again. She admitted to earlier confessions, but claimed they'd been coerced. She told the court she had lied to escape Yo's violent leash. According to this new narrative, she'd made up accusations to get him jailed so she could be free. The courtroom was stunned. How could a woman who had identified the very site where Ton's body was found suddenly deny everything she previously swore to? The jury deliberated and returned a verdict. Guilty. Levetner was sentenced to life without parole. Yo's trial was next. He swore he was innocent, but when Levetner was convicted and the evidence seemed to corner him, Joe's defense shifted. His lawyer advised a no-contest plea, nolo contendere, a legal maneuver where a defendant neither admits nor denies guilt, but accepts conviction. It's often treated by the court as tantamount to a guilty plea, yet it can sometimes reduce sentencing exposure. Joe took the deal, receiving a life sentence plus years, thereby avoiding the death penalty, which Oregon still allowed at that time. The police, satisfied and relieved, believed the case closed. Levetner and Yo were behind bars. The community exhaled, but their relief would be short-lived. In 1991, 3 years after Ton's death, someone spray-painted a message in a truck stop restroom in Montana, a taunting admission accompanied by a crude smiling face. The Montana authorities contacted Oregon. Both sides initially treated it as a juvenile prank. The Ton Gia case had drawn national coverage. People had attention to spare. Might someone be mocking the case for laughs? Then in 1994, a handwritten anonymous letter arrived at an Oregon courthouse, a letter that fully embraced the taunt. Its writer claimed responsibility for Ton's killing and described details only the killer would know. Handwriting experts compared it to the graffiti in Montana and determined the two matched. The letter ended with the same grotesque smiling face. Soon after, a Montana newspaper received a similar letter. This one was more chilling. It not only claimed responsibility for Tangia's murder, but listed 6 other women, bodies left in other states, and again finished with that drawing of a grin. Police began to compare cold cases described in the letter to unsolved murders across several states. The locations matched. Suddenly, something far bigger than a single tragedy emerged. This was not an isolated event. It might be the trail of a serial killer, one who signed his crimes by scribbling an obscene smiling face. Reporters christened him the Smiling Killer. For many, a smile was once an emblem of innocence. Now it was a signature of terror. The pressure on law enforcement mounted. With scant physical evidence and a killer speaking through letters and graffiti, detectives were left piecing together a jigsaw where most of the pieces were missing. Then in 1995, another body would be discovered that shook the case back to life. On a late spring morning that year, the body of Jolly Windingham, 41, was found in the brush near the Columbia Gorge. She'd been raped and strangled. Her mouth had been taped shut. The circumstances were disturbingly similar to Tan's case. Jolly's mother recalled a tall man who'd visited her daughter claiming to be a trucker named Chris. The daughter had spoken of love and marriage until she disappeared. While looking into the case, detectives uncovered a bill of sale for Jolly's truck. The buyer listed was a man named Kent Hunter Z. Kent, tall, Canadian, a long-haul trucker who frequently crossed state lines, matched the outline witnesses had given in earlier cases. He had no known criminal record. He was 40 at the time, nearly 2 meters tall, and always on the move. Detectives quietly pulled Kent's files. They discovered he'd recently been in Chicago and was now heading to New Mexico. A surveillance team found him at a truck stop and brought him in for questioning. Kent's face went pale. In a 5-hour interrogation, Kent admitted to a relationship with Jolly. Tumultuous, often violent. He claimed their last meeting had ended with Jolly demanding to get out of the truck. When she left, he hadn't heard from her again. Kent seemed oddly nonchalant about Jolly's disappearance. Without direct evidence, the police let him go. But not before one officer handed him a business card and told him, in no uncertain terms, to call within a week to clear his name or else face closer scrutiny. Days later, Kent called. He said simply and oddly, "I want to turn myself in," then abruptly hung up. Before that call reached the police, they intercepted a letter he'd sent to his brother. The contents were unnerving. It referenced 8 victims in total, the first being Ton, the last being Jolly, and detailed the other 6 murders the anonymous letter had mentioned. The investigators compared DNA taken from the taunting letters to Kent's DNA sample. The result, a match. The man behind the smiling face was Kent Hunter Z. The confession that followed was chilling, but also disturbingly mundane. Kent admitted to killing 8 women across several states between 1990 and 1995. He described how he'd met some victims at truck stops, in bars, or brought them to his cab. He said he'd assaulted and killed them, and then dumped their bodies in remote places. Some victims had been sex workers, people the public often ignored, which is why Kent could operate under the radar for so long. He admitted to writing the letters, carving the smiling face into public spaces, and deliberately diverting attention to other suspects. He confessed that the first murder, Ton's, had sparked a perverse rage when the attention fell elsewhere. When others were arrested, when the press fixated on the wrong people. He wanted the spotlight. He wanted to be feared and seen. When the dust settled, Kent was prosecuted and found guilty. He received multiple life sentences and was imprisoned in Oregon. His conviction sent shockwaves across a nation that had, for years, been unnerved by the smiling letter writer, but hadn't known his face. For Levetner and Yo, who had endured years behind bars for a crime they did not commit, justice finally came in a different form. Their convictions were overturned in January 1996. Pardon, release, and, for Levetner, a flood of tears as she stepped out of prison at 64, hair gray, eyes tired. Families wept, communities argued, and the long question of culpability, procedure, and the fallibility of investigations echoed in courtrooms long after. How had Levetner and Yo been convicted in the first place? Part of the answer lay in human psychology, the desperate hunger to close a case, to answer grieving families, to show that the wheels of justice could move. Levetner had repeatedly implicated Yo, given up dirtied fabric and precise directions, even identified the dump site. Yet under scrutiny, her story fractured. She had motive to mislead, a history of abuse at the hands of Yo, and an obsession with escape. In a tragic irony, the same media attention that had sought a closure turned 2 people's lives inside out. And what of Kent? His biography did more to explain the crime than it did to excuse it. He was born in British Columbia, Canada, into a fractured household, a drunk and violent father, an indifferent mother. He suffered mockery at school because of his tremendous size. As a young boy, he was cruel to animals and later exhibited sadistic tendencies. His adolescence featured instances of cruelty and a troubling willingness to escalate. He'd been sexually abused by a relative at age 14, something he told investigators but did not fully process or disclose at the time. Kent married young, had 3 children, but the marriage fell apart amid accusations of infidelity and a volatile temper. Once unshackled from family responsibilities, the life of a trucker offered Kent an ideal camouflage. Endless interstate miles and nameless faces, a perfect backdrop for predation. Kent's pattern was textbook for the traveling killer. He used his mobility to strike in different jurisdictions, making links between crimes hard to establish. The victims were often the vulnerable, women who would be missed slowly, if at all. When finally confronted with the evidence, Kent's demeanor was chillingly calm. He was articulate, sometimes almost casual, even jovial in conversation. He told an interviewer years later, as if narrating a job rather than confessing to murder, that he had killed to feel something powerful and in control. When asked why he had written letters and painted smiling faces, he said he wanted attention. He wanted to be feared and known. It was the ultimate obscene performance, murder for the sake of notoriety. After his arrest, Kent roused the public's worst anxieties. He claimed to have killed far more than the 8 he was convicted of at one point, claiming to have killed over 160 people. Investigators found no evidence to support such a tally. Many believed he was exaggerating once again, a final hunger for notoriety even behind bars. When you step back, the Smiling Killer case is a brutal, complicated lesson. It shows how violence can be born from neglect and cruelty, how an offender can exploit mobility and anonymity, and how a society's rush for answers can sometimes topple the innocent. It shows us the dark psychology of a perpetrator who craved attention and used grotesque theatrics, graffiti, letters, a drawn smile to feed his hunger. And it shows the terrible cost. Lives snuffed out, families destroyed, 2 people wrongfully imprisoned for years, while the real killer roamed free. The story also raises questions about how justice is done. In the Tungia investigation, the police did what they could with limited forensic tools and scarce data. They leapt at a lead. They followed a confession and evidence that later failed to hold up. They were human and under pressure. Humans make mistakes, but there's a difference between error and malice. This case seems to have been driven by human frailty, not malice. Still, the cost of that frailty was devastating. Kent was eventually convicted across multiple states and sentenced to many years behind bars, years that could never restore the victims or bring back what was lost. Levetner and Yo were exonerated but could never reclaim the time, the shame, the life they had lost. The victims' families were left with a strange, bitter aftertaste. Closure accompanied by the knowledge that it took a blood-soaked trail and the incompetence of rumor and desperation to find the truth. And the smiling face? What once signaled innocence and warmth was turned into a symbol of terror. That the killer used such a caricature to taunt police and the public is a grotesque commentary on his need to be seen. Perhaps that is the most chilling part. He didn't hide. He wanted to be noticed. This case remains a mirror showing both the darkest corners of human behavior and the ways systems meant to protect us can misstep. It reminds us to be meticulous, to resist the rush to judgment, and to give weight to evidence over confession when circumstances are messy. It also reminds us painfully that the headlines hunger for neat endings, but life seldom grants them without cost. Whenever new details surface in cold cases, investigators revisit the files. Families, after decades of limbo, sometimes find answers, but many wounds never fully heal. The names of Tungia, Jolly Windingham, and the others carved into this story are not mere footnotes in some morbid catalog. They are human beings who were loved, whose absence shaped the lives of those left behind. So what do we take away? That evil can wear many faces, even a smile, and that attention can be both reward and weapon. That justice must be patient and evidence-driven. And that the vulnerable deserve protection attention, and care precisely so perpetrators cannot hide in their shadows. If there's a final bitter irony in this tale, it's that the smiling killer wanted fame, but he also wanted to be feared. In the end, he got both, but at a cost measured in lives. When Kent Hunter Z finally faced the consequences of his actions, he sat in a prison cell with the world knowing his name. But for every name he wore like a badge, there are families still picking up the pieces. That's the story of the Smiling Killer, a haunting chapter in America's true crime annals that forces us to confront how far we must go to protect the vulnerable, how careful we must be with accusations and confessions, and how thin the line can be between being seen and being infamous. Thank you for listening. If you found this story compelling, subscribe, because there are more cases like this dark, complicated, and instructive waiting to be told. I'll be back with another true crime deep dive soon. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.